The rancher gave his only blanket to two Apache sisters. By dawn, 300 warriors arrived. The rancher had learned long ago that nights on the open land were never truly quiet. Even when the wind slowed and the animals rested, the land still breathed. It whispered through dry grass, moved softly across the hills, and pressed against the walls of his small wooden cabin. He had lived alone for many years, far from towns and crowded places. Some people said he chose loneliness. Others said loneliness had chosen him. Either way, he had grown used to it. That night began like many others. The sky had been clear during the day, and the sun had gone down in a calm orange glow. The rancher finished feeding his animals, locked the barn doors, and returned to his cabin. He warmed a simple meal over the fire and sat quietly listening. Life on the ranch followed a steady rhythm, and he trusted that rhythm more than anything else. But after midnight, the air changed. The wind rose suddenly, sharp and cold. Clouds rolled in fast, covering the stars. Rain began as a light tapping on the roof, then turned heavy, mixed with icy drops that stung when they struck wood and earth. The rancher added more wood to the fire and wrapped his coat tighter around his shoulders. Storms were not unusual, but something about this one felt different. It felt restless, like the land itself was uneasy. As the storm grew louder, he heard a sound that did not belong to the wind or rain. At first, it was faint, almost lost in the noise of the storm. A soft movement, then a quiet cry carried briefly by the wind before disappearing again. The rancher froze, listening closely. He had learned to trust his instincts. Out here, ignoring a sound could mean trouble. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Cold rain soaked his coat instantly. The lantern light barely cut through the darkness. He scanned the area near the barn, his eyes adjusting slowly. Then he saw them. Two small figures stood near the edge of the barn, pressed close to the wall for shelter. They were soaked, shaking, and clearly exhausted. Even from a distance, he could tell they were young. Girls. Their hair clung to their faces and their clothes were thin and worn. For a moment, the rancher did not move. He knew the stories everyone told. Stories filled with fear and warnings. Stories that taught people to close their doors and turn away. Living alone had not made him foolish. He understood risk, but he also understood something else. No one stood in a storm like this unless they had nowhere else to go. He raised the lantern slightly and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He did not shout. He did not command. He simply spoke as one human to another. The girls flinched but did not run. One of them stepped slightly in front of the other, protective despite her weakness. Her eyes were wide, not with anger but with fear. The rancher could see their hands trembling, their feet bare and muddy from walking too long in the cold. He lowered the lantern a bit, making himself seem smaller, less threatening. He gestured toward the cabin and then to the storm around them. He did not share their language, but kindness has a way of crossing barriers words cannot. Slowly, carefully, the sisters followed him. Inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around them like a living thing. The fire crackled softly. The girls hesitated at the doorway, unsure, as if they feared the warmth itself might vanish if they stepped too far. The rancher closed the door gently and set the lantern down. He offered them water first, placing the cups on the table and stepping back to give them space. They drank quietly, their hands still shaking. The older sister kept glancing at him, watching his every move. The younger one stared at the fire, her face pale, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The rancher noticed their condition with a tight feeling in his chest. Their clothes were soaked through. Their lips were slightly blue from the cold. They had walked far, that much was clear. How far he could only guess. He had no extra room, no soft beds, no abundance of supplies. His cabin was built for one man and simple living, but he had shelter, warmth, and a heart that had not hardened, no matter how many years he spent alone. He placed a small pot of food near the fire, simple and warm. The smell filled the cabin, and the younger sister finally looked at him, her eyes showing hunger she had tried to hide. He nodded gently, giving permission without words. They ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear. The rancher sat a short distance away, not wanting to overwhelm them. He watched the fire instead, pretending not to notice how thin they were, how tired. As the storm raged outside, the cabin became its own small world. Wind struck the walls, rain drummed on the roof, but inside there was only the fire, the soft sound of breathing, and the quiet understanding that for this moment they were safe. When the food was finished, the cold returned. Wet clothes dried slowly, but the night was long, and the fire could only do so much. The rancher looked around his cabin, knowing the truth before he fully accepted it. There was only one blanket. It was old but clean, folded neatly near his bed. He had used it for years. It had kept him warm through many nights just like this one. He looked at the sisters again. The younger one had begun to shiver once more, trying to be brave but failing. The older sister wrapped her arms around her, rubbing her back, whispering softly. The rancher stood, picked up the blanket, and walked toward them. He did not hesitate. He draped the blanket over both girls, tucking it gently around their shoulders. Their eyes widened in surprise. The older sister looked up at him, her expression shifting from fear to something else, something deeper, heavier. She touched the edge of the blanket as if to make sure it was real. The rancher moved back to his chair and sat down near the fire. He pulled his coat tighter and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The cold slowly crept into his bones, but he did not complain. He did not regret his choice. All through the night he stayed awake. The storm eased little by little. Rain softened. Wind slowed. The fire burned low, and he added wood carefully so the noise would not wake them. He watched the sisters sleep, curled close together, finally at rest. Their breathing became steady, peaceful for the first time that night. As hours passed, the rancher thought about how small choices can carry weight far beyond the moment. He did not know who the girls were or where they had come from. He did not know what would happen when morning arrived. But he knew this: turning them away would have haunted him far more than any fear he carried. Just before dawn, the older sister stirred. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the younger one. She looked at the rancher, who met her gaze without speaking. She pressed a hand to her chest and then extended it slightly toward him, a quiet gesture of thanks. The rancher nodded once. The sisters rose quietly, wrapping the blanket around themselves. They moved toward the door, pausing only once to look back. The rancher opened the door for them, letting in the cool morning air. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and silent. They stepped outside and disappeared into the open land as the sky began to lighten. The rancher stood in the doorway for a long moment after they were gone. He did not know that this night, this single act of kindness, had already begun a story much larger than himself. He only knew that the land was quiet again, and that some choices once made could never be undone. Morning arrived slowly, as it often did on the open land. The sky changed color little by little, from deep gray to soft blue, and the air carried the clean smell left behind by the storm. The rancher woke stiff and tired, his body sore from sitting near the fire all night. For a moment, he forgot everything. Then he noticed the empty space near the fire where the sisters had slept, and the memory of the night returned at once. The cabin felt different now, quieter, colder. He rose from his chair and stretched, rubbing his arms to bring back warmth. The blanket was gone, just as he expected. He had known they would take it, and he was glad they did. The cold nights on the plains were unforgiving, especially for those who had nothing. He stepped outside to begin his morning work. The land looked peaceful, as if nothing unusual had happened. The grass glistened with drops of water. The animals stirred gently, unaware of how close danger and change had passed through the night. Yet something inside the rancher felt unsettled. A small weight rested in his chest, not fear but thoughtfulness. As he fed the animals and checked the fences, his mind returned again and again to the sisters. Where had they come from? How far had they walked? Were they safe now? He told himself there was no reason to worry. They had strength in their eyes. They had survived the storm. Still, he could not fully push the thoughts away. By midday, the sun had warmed the ground and the rancher returned to his cabin for a simple meal. He sat at the table, staring at the empty hook where the blanket once hung. He realized how little he truly owned. His life had been shaped by loss and distance. Over the years, he had learned to live with just enough. Giving away the blanket had not changed his situation much, yet it felt like something important had been taken from the cabin, not the warmth, but the reminder of his solitude. That afternoon, a neighbor rode past the edge of the property, slowing his horse when he saw the rancher. They exchanged brief words, as people often did in wide places where long conversations were rare. The neighbor mentioned seeing signs of movement in the distance, unusual tracks near the river. His tone carried quiet concern. The rancher listened but said little. He did not mention the sisters or the night before. Some things felt better left unspoken. Still, as the neighbor rode away, the rancher felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. He knew how quickly fear traveled across the land, changing small moments into dangerous stories. As evening approached, clouds gathered again, though this time they brought no storm. The rancher repaired a loose board on the barn and stacked firewood for the coming night. He worked carefully, keeping his movements slow and steady. His thoughts remained restless. He told himself he had done the right thing. Kindness should not require explanation or reward. Yet he also knew the world did not always return kindness with the same care. He accepted that truth long ago. Living alone had taught him to face consequences quietly. When darkness fell, the rancher locked the doors and lit the lantern. Without the blanket, the cabin felt sharper, less forgiving. He fed the fire and sat near it, letting the warmth touch his hands. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, holding secrets he could not see. Hours passed. The night deepened. Then he heard it. At first, it was only a faint vibration, barely noticeable, like distant thunder without clouds. He paused, holding his breath. The sound came again, steadier now. Not wind, not animals, something else. He stepped outside, lantern in hand. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving the land in shadow. The sound grew clearer, rhythmic, controlled. Hooves. The rancher's heart beat faster, but his mind stayed calm. Panic had never helped anyone. He stood still, listening. The ground itself seemed to carry the noise, spreading it outward. Whatever was coming was not close yet, but it was moving with purpose. He returned to the cabin and set the lantern down. He sat at the table, resting his hands flat on the wood. He did not reach for a weapon. He had one stored away, but he did not touch it. Deep inside, he understood that fear would only make things worse. The sound continued through the night, fading and returning like waves against a shore. The rancher did not sleep. He fed the fire when needed and waited. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. The rancher stepped outside as the sky began to lighten. At the edge of the land, far across the open ground, shapes stood against the pale horizon. Many shapes, too many to count easily. They did not move forward. They did not shout. They simply waited. The rancher felt no urge to run. Something in the stillness told him this was not a moment for escape. He stood tall, his back straight, his hands empty at his sides. He knew that whatever was coming next would be decided not by force, but by the choices already made. As the first light of morning spread across the land, the figures became clearer. Riders. Rows of them, stretching wider than his property, their presence strong and silent. The rancher counted again and again, unable to believe his eyes. Nearly 300. His breath slowed. He thought of the sisters. He thought of the blanket. He thought of the quiet night and the fire burning low. The pieces began to fit together. The riders remained still, as if waiting for the land itself to speak. Dust rose gently around their horses' feet, catching the light of the rising sun. The rancher took one step forward, then stopped. He did not know what would happen next, but he knew one thing clearly. The night's kindness had not ended with dawn. The land held its breath. The rancher stood where he was, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. The land before him felt different now, heavier, as if it were holding a deep secret. The riders remained still, spread across the open ground like a living wall. Their horses shifted slightly, stamping the earth, but no one moved forward. No one spoke. Time seemed to slow. The rancher took a careful step away from the cabin and into the open. His boots pressed into the damp soil left by the storm. He kept his hands visible, empty, and relaxed at his sides. Every lesson life had taught him whispered the same message: stay calm, stay honest, and do not act from fear. As he moved forward, a single rider separated from the group. The rider advanced slowly, stopping a short distance away. The morning light revealed strong features and calm eyes that missed nothing. This was not a man driven by anger. This was someone who carried responsibility. The rancher stopped as well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently between them, carrying the smell of wet earth. Birds flew overhead, unaware of the quiet tension below. Then the rider spoke. His voice was steady, not raised, not threatening. He asked the rancher if he was the man who lived on this land. The rancher nodded once. He did not add anything else. There was no need. The rider studied him carefully, as if searching for something beyond words. After a pause, he gestured behind him. Two figures stepped forward from the line of riders, the sisters. They looked different now. Their clothes were dry. Their posture was stronger. Yet when their eyes met the rancher's, something familiar passed between them. Recognition, memory. The older sister stepped forward slightly. She spoke, her voice clear but soft. She told the rider what had happened during the storm. She spoke of the cold night, the fear, the small cabin, and the fire. She spoke of the water, the food, and the man who gave away his only blanket without being asked. As she spoke, the rancher kept his eyes on the ground. He did not feel proud. He did not feel brave. He had only done what felt right at the time. When the sister finished, silence returned. The rider nodded slowly, then looked back at the rancher. He asked why the rancher had helped them, knowing the risk. The rancher lifted his gaze and met the rider's eyes. His voice was quiet but steady. He said he helped because they were cold and alone, because turning them away would have been wrong, because sometimes the right thing is simple, even when the consequences are not. The rider listened without interrupting. Then, something unexpected happened. The rider dismounted. He placed one hand over his chest and bowed his head slightly. It was not a grand movement, but it carried deep meaning. The riders behind him followed his example, remaining still but attentive. The rancher felt a shift in the air, as if a storm had passed without rain. The rider spoke again. He said the sisters were under the protection of their people. He said their story had reached many ears before the sun rose. He said they had come not to bring harm, but to see with their own eyes the man who chose kindness when fear would have been easier. One of the riders stepped forward and held out the blanket. It was clean, folded neatly, just as it had been before. The rancher stared at it for a moment, unsure what to do. The rider gently placed it into his hands. He said it was returned with respect, not because it was owed, but because it was remembered. The rancher accepted the blanket slowly. His fingers brushed the worn fabric and a tight feeling rose in his chest. He had not expected this. He had not expected anything. The rider continued speaking. He said that the land remembered actions just as people did. He said that no harm would come to this ranch. That travelers would know this place as one marked by honor. That the story of the night would be carried forward, not as a warning, but as a lesson. The rancher nodded, words failing him for the first time. The sisters stepped closer. The younger one smiled faintly. The older sister touched the edge of the blanket once more, then stepped back beside her people. The riders mounted their horses again, one by one. Dust rose softly as they turned, forming lines that moved like a single body. Before leaving, the rider looked back once more. His expression held no threat, only certainty. Then they were gone. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the open land. The rancher stood alone again, the blanket held tightly in his hands. The sun climbed higher, warming his face. The land returned to its quiet rhythm as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had changed. The rancher returned to his cabin slowly. He folded the blanket and placed it back where it belonged. He sat at the table and rested his hands on the wood, letting the moment settle into him. He understood now that the night had been a test, not of strength, but of character, and that the answer he gave had traveled farther than he ever imagined. Outside, the land breathed on, carrying the story forward. If you want, I can continue with part 4, keeping the same simple English, length, and engaging flow. The rancher stood for a long time after the riders disappeared. The morning sun had fully risen now, washing the land in soft gold and warming the wet earth. Birds chirped from the trees, and the wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the smell of rain and fresh soil. Everything seemed calm again, yet the rancher knew the quiet was different this time. Something had shifted. Something larger than himself had entered his life and would not leave quietly. He went back into the cabin and sat at his worn wooden table. The blanket he had given to the sisters now rested folded neatly where it had always been, yet it no longer felt like just a piece of cloth. It carried memory, honor, and respect. He ran his fingers over it, remembering the cold faces of the sisters, the shivering, the fear, and how small his cabin had seemed to them. That single act, so simple, so human, had grown beyond his understanding. Hours passed, and the rancher continued his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He repaired fences, fed the animals, and prepared a fire for the coming night. But every sound, every shadow, every movement reminded him of what had happened. He kept thinking about the sisters, about the riders, about the respect that had been shown in return for something he had not expected to be noticed. It was strange, almost surreal. For all his years of living alone, he had never imagined that such a small act could ripple out in such a powerful way. As he worked, he noticed the land itself seemed different. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The animals were calmer, as if even they sensed that something extraordinary had passed through the property. The wind whispered softly through the cabin, and the rancher paused to listen. He realized that the land remembered every act of courage, every gesture of kindness, every moment of honesty, and that those memories shaped how the world moved forward. The sun moved higher, and travelers began to pass nearby. Some stopped to speak, curious about the rancher who lived so far from towns and townspeople. They did not know the story, of course. None of them could have guessed what had happened in the small hours before dawn. Yet even in their simple greetings, there was an unspoken respect. People sensed the strength of his character, the quiet confidence of a man who acted not for reward or recognition, but because it was right. By evening, the rancher had finished his chores and returned to the cabin. He fed the fire and sat quietly, thinking of the sisters once again. He wondered where they were, what they were doing, and whether they were safe with their people. He thought of the riders, of the calm authority they had shown, and of the lessons he had learned without any words being spoken. Respect, he realized, was earned not through force or fear, but through honesty, courage, and simple acts of compassion. The next morning, he received a small but unexpected sign of connection. A piece of cloth, similar to the blanket, had been left outside his door, folded neatly and untouched by wind or rain. It was a gift, a token of gratitude, and a reminder that the story of kindness traveled faster and farther than he could imagine. He held the cloth in his hands, running his fingers over it slowly. It was smooth, clean, and comforting. He understood that respect was a living thing. It moved between people and communities, growing stronger each time it was acknowledged. Days passed, and the rancher returned to his routine, but the memory of that night remained alive. When he walked the land, he did so with a new awareness, noticing small signs of life, the ways the wind shifted, the paths animals had taken. Everything seemed connected. Even the smallest choices mattered, and he carried that knowledge with him in every action. Feeding the animals, repairing fences, and tending to the cabin now held deeper meaning. Every task was a reflection of care, patience, and responsibility. Word of the rancher's kindness began to spread quietly through the region. Travelers spoke of the man who had protected two young girls in the storm. Stories traveled from town to town, changing slightly with each telling, but always returning to the central truth. The rancher had acted with compassion when fear would have been easier. People began to treat the rancher with a new level of respect. They did not come to test him or challenge him. They came to understand him, to meet a man whose actions had left a lasting impression. Over time, the rancher noticed small gestures from those who had heard the story. A neighbor would bring extra food without saying why. Travelers would pause to offer assistance, simple gestures that showed recognition of his integrity. The rancher never asked for these things, never expected them, but he felt their significance deeply. The world, he realized, could respond to goodness in ways that were quiet but powerful. One evening, months after the storm, the rancher reflected on everything that had happened. The sisters, the riders, the blanket, all of it formed a memory that would stay with him forever. He understood now that the night had tested more than his courage. It had tested his heart. By acting without hesitation, without expectation, he had proven that kindness can exist even in the harshest conditions. That simple decision made in the cold darkness had echoed across the land, creating a chain of respect, honor, and trust. As the sun set over the plains, painting the sky with orange and purple hues, the rancher felt a deep sense of peace. The land stretched endlessly before him, quiet yet alive. He knew that the story of that night would not end with him. It would be carried forward, remembered by those who had witnessed it and told to those who had not. Acts of kindness, he realized, never truly disappear. They grow, they travel, and they inspire others in ways that are often unseen but always felt. The rancher returned to the cabin, sitting near the fire once more. He folded the blanket carefully, placing it back on the shelf. It no longer represented just warmth for the night. It was a symbol of humanity, of courage, and of the truth that small actions can have immense consequences. The cabin was quiet, the animals settled, and the land held its calm once more. He understood now that life on the plains, while lonely at times, had a rhythm that carried lessons in every gust of wind and every drop of rain. Each day was a chance to act with integrity, to respond with care, and to recognize the interconnectedness of all living things. The storm, the sisters, the riders, they had all become part of his understanding of the world, teaching him that courage was not always measured in strength or weaponry, but in the ability to act rightly when it mattered most. That night, as he finally allowed himself to rest, the rancher felt a quiet satisfaction. The fire burned low and the stars shone through a clear sky. He thought of the sisters, safe and remembered. He thought of the riders who had honored him with respect rather than fear. He thought of the blanket, simple yet profound, carrying a story of humanity that would last far longer than the storm or even his own lifetime. And as sleep finally came, the rancher knew that the land, the wind, and the people who had passed through that night would never forget the quiet courage of a man who had chosen kindness when it mattered most. The days following that extraordinary morning passed in quiet rhythm, but the rancher noticed that nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every sound of the wind through the grass, Every bird that sang at dawn, every ripple of sunlight on the wet earth seemed to carry the memory of that night. The storm, the two sisters, and the riders who had come afterward had left a mark not only on his life, but on the land itself. He had given what little he had without expectation, and in return, he had received respect, gratitude, and a lesson that would last a lifetime. He continued his daily work with the animals and the land, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and checking the barns. But now there was a quiet awareness in every movement. When he reached for a tool, he remembered the hands of the sisters trembling in the cold. When he fed the animals, he thought of how he had offered warmth and care when it was needed most. The rancher realized that even simple acts could carry great significance, touching lives in ways that could never be measured. Travelers who passed the ranch began to notice subtle differences in how the land seemed to welcome them. Some spoke of hearing about the man who had helped the sisters during the storm, and even if they didn't know the full story, they could feel the sense of peace and honesty that lingered in the place. People treated the rancher with quiet respect, offering small gestures, a nod of approval, extra supplies, or a smile, without words. The rancher rarely responded, but inside he felt the deep warmth of connection that reached beyond spoken language. One afternoon, as he repaired a fence near the edge of his property, he noticed tracks in the mud. They were careful, deliberate, and familiar. He followed them briefly and found signs of the sisters' presence once again. Perhaps they had returned to check on him or to see the land where they had found warmth and safety. He did not rush to meet them, understanding that their lives belonged to a different world, one he could only observe from a distance. Still, the reminder of their courage, their trust, and the impact of a single night stayed with him. Time moved forward steadily. Seasons changed, and with them came the usual cycles of the ranch: planting, growth, harvest, cold nights, and warm days. Yet even as the world continued, the story of that night seemed to echo through every season. The rancher would catch himself pausing in the middle of work, remembering the two sisters, the way the blanket had covered them, and the moment the riders had arrived. It was a memory that grew with him, teaching patience, humility, and understanding. The rancher also noticed how the story spread quietly through the region. Neighbors and travelers spoke of a man who had acted from kindness, not fear, during a storm. It was not a story told for fame or reward, but as a reminder of what people could accomplish through compassion. Some came from far away, curious to meet the rancher whose simple choice had become a legend. He welcomed them with quiet dignity, never boasting, never demanding acknowledgement, simply allowing the story to stand on its own merit. As years passed, the rancher saw new faces on the land. Children grew up hearing about the night of the storm, about the sisters, and about the men who had arrived on horseback. They learned that courage and kindness were intertwined, that a single action could ripple through time and space. The rancher sometimes watched quietly from the edge of his property as young people played and worked, knowing that the lessons of that night had spread further than he could imagine. Even in solitude, he never felt alone again. The land, the animals, the travelers, and the memory of the sisters became companions in their own way. Every sunrise reminded him that the world carried both challenges and opportunities for goodness. Every sunset reminded him that acts of care, no matter how small, could leave lasting impressions. He learned that fear could be met with courage, and that courage could take many forms, not just through strength or fighting, but through simple, selfless decisions. One winter evening, long after the original storm had faded from memory, the rancher sat by his fire, the blanket folded neatly on the chair beside him. He thought of the sisters, imagining them safe with their people, their lives full of the same resilience and strength they had shown that cold night. He remembered the riders, their calm authority, and the respect they had shown him. And he remembered himself, a solitary man who had done what he thought was right without expectation, discovering that his choices mattered far beyond his cabin walls. The rancher realized that life, like the land he tended, was shaped by small actions, careful attention, and respect for others. He thought about the countless ways the world could be harsh, and yet how acts of compassion could turn fear into trust, danger into understanding, and strangers into allies. He understood now that the story of that night was not just his story, or the story of the sisters, or even the writers. It was a story of humanity, a lesson that would travel quietly but persistently through generations. Years later, even when the rancher grew older and his movements slowed, people continued to visit the ranch. They came to see the man who had given what little he had and received far more in return. They came to witness the land where respect and honor had been recognized without words, where courage and kindness had triumphed over fear. The rancher greeted each visitor with calm simplicity, never asking for attention, never claiming credit. He allowed the story to carry itself, trusting that truth always traveled further than exaggeration. The land around the ranch remained as vast and open as ever, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Yet it had changed subtly. Travelers, neighbors, and even the animals seemed to respond differently, sensing that this was a place where integrity mattered, where choices held weight, and where every life mattered. The rancher, for his part, continued his work, understanding that the world rewarded not those who sought recognition, but those who acted rightly when no one was watching. And so the story endured. It was remembered not for its drama or danger, but for its quiet strength. It was remembered because it proved that simple acts of courage and kindness could leave an impact far greater than one could ever imagine. The rancher's life, once ordinary and solitary, became extraordinary not through wealth or power, but through integrity, compassion, and the understanding that the choices we make shape not only our own lives, but the lives of countless others. The rancher often thought back to that first stormy night, to the two sisters who had arrived cold and afraid, to the blanket that had been his only possession to offer. He remembered the riders who came not to harm but to honor. And he realized that night had changed him, the land, and the world around him. It had taught him that even in moments of uncertainty, even when risk seemed high, doing what is right carries a weight that can never be taken away. Finally, as the sun set on another quiet evening, the rancher sat outside and watched the horizon stretch endlessly before him. He held the blanket, thinking of the past, but also of the future, the people who would hear the story, the lessons that would travel quietly, and the ways kindness and courage would continue to ripple across the land. He smiled softly, knowing that the storm had passed, yet its lessons would endure forever. The rancher had learned, and the world had remembered, that even the smallest acts of humanity could echo across time, leaving a mark far greater than any storm, any struggle, or any moment of fear. And with that understanding, the rancher rested, confident that the story of that night and the choices he had made would live on, quietly, powerfully, and forever remembered by those whose lives it had touched.